It seems like this.
Mike Henderson had been driving 18-wheelers for over 15 years when he encountered something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was a cold February night in 2018, and Mike was hauling a load of electronics from Phoenix to Denver along Interstate 25. As an experienced night driver, he was used to the isolation, the endless stretches of dark highway, and the strange cast of characters that emerged after midnight. But nothing had prepared him for what happened during those terrifying hours between 2 a.m. and dawn. The trouble started just outside of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Mike had pulled into a truck stop to grab coffee and check his logbook when he noticed a beat-up white sedan parked in the shadows near the edge of the lot. The car itself wasn't unusual. Plenty of broke-down vehicles littered truck stops across America. What caught his attention was the figure sitting motionless behind the wheel, staring directly at him through the windshield. The person appeared to be a middle-aged man with stringy hair and hollow cheeks. Even from a distance of 50 yards, Mike could feel the intensity of that stare. It made his skin crawl. He tried to shake off the feeling, finished his business quickly, and climbed back into his cab. As he pulled out of the truck stop and merged back onto I-25 northbound, he checked his mirrors. The white sedan was following him. At first, Mike told himself it was just coincidence. Maybe the guy was heading north too. But as the miles rolled by, the sedan maintained a consistent distance of about a quarter mile behind his trailer. When Mike sped up, the car sped up. When he slowed down, it slowed down. When he changed lanes, it changed lanes. The headlights in his mirror became a constant menacing presence. Around 3 a.m., Mike decided to test his suspicions. He took an exit for a small town called Santa Rosa, circling through the empty streets before getting back on the interstate. The white sedan followed his exact route, never getting closer, never falling back. Mike's hands began to sweat on the steering wheel. This wasn't random. Someone was deliberately stalking him. The psychological pressure was immense. Every time Mike glanced in his mirrors, those headlights were there, boring into him like eyes in the darkness. He tried calling other truckers on his CB radio, but the late hour meant few drivers were awake and chatty. The isolation felt crushing. Mile after mile, hour after hour, the pursuit continued with mechanical precision. What made it even more terrifying was the driver's behavior. Normal stalkers might try to pass, make threatening gestures, or attempt some kind of contact. This person did none of that. They simply followed with the patience of a predator, maintaining that exact distance, never wavering, never giving any indication of their intentions. The uncertainty was maddening. Mike's mind raced with possibilities. Was this a serial killer who targeted truck drivers? He'd heard stories about highway killers who preyed on isolated drivers. Was it someone planning to rob him at a fuel stop? Or was it something even worse? Maybe the beginning of an elaborate trap involving multiple vehicles. By 4 a.m., Mike was fighting panic. His coffee had gone cold, his radio crackled with static, and those headlights remained fixed in his mirrors like glowing eyes. He considered calling 911, but what would he tell them? That someone was driving behind him on a public highway? Police dealt with real crimes, not paranoid truckers spooked by traffic. Then something changed. As they approached the Colorado border, the sedan began to close the distance. Slowly, methodically, it crept closer to Mike's trailer. A quarter mile became 500 yards, then 300 yards, then 200. Mike's heart hammered in his chest. After hours of maintaining perfect distance, why was the stalker suddenly getting closer? The answer came when Mike spotted a rest area ahead. As he passed the exit, he watched in his mirror as the white sedan took the off-ramp and disappeared into the darkness. Relief flooded through Mike's body like a physical wave. The nightmare was over. But it wasn't over. 3 weeks later, Mike was running the same Phoenix to Denver route. Different load, different night, but the same stretch of I-25. Around 2:30 a.m., just south of Albuquerque, a familiar sight appeared in his mirrors. A white sedan, maintaining that same precise quarter-mile distance. The same hollow-faced driver. The same methodical stalking behavior. This time, Mike was ready. He had his phone charged and 911 on speed dial. But again, the sedan followed for hours, without making any threatening moves, disappeared at the Colorado border, and left Mike questioning his own sanity. What kind of person spent entire nights following random truck drivers? What was the point? The third encounter happened a month later. Same route, same time, same white sedan. By now, Mike had done research. He'd contacted other drivers, posted on trucking forums, and even reached out to state police. What he discovered chilled him to the bone. Mike wasn't the only victim. Over the course of 2017 and 2018, at least 7 other truck drivers reported being followed by a white sedan on I-25 through New Mexico. Always the same stretch of highway. Always between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. Always the same behavior pattern. Methodical following. Perfect distance maintenance. Disappearance at the Colorado border. But there was more. 2 drivers reported that after their encounters, they'd discovered their personal information, home addresses, family members' names, work schedules, had been researched and compiled by someone. One driver found evidence that someone had been watching his house. Another discovered that his wife had been followed to work. The implications were terrifying. This wasn't random highway harassment. Someone was using the interstate to identify and research potential victims. The hours of patient following weren't just psychological torture. They were reconnaissance. The stalker was learning routes, schedules, and habits. Building files on isolated drivers who traveled predictable paths through empty country. Mike never found out who was behind the wheel of that white sedan. Despite reports to multiple law enforcement agencies, the stalker was never caught. The encounters simply stopped in late 2018, as mysteriously as they had begun. Maybe the person moved on to a different hunting ground. Maybe they escalated to more serious crimes in another state. Or maybe they're still out there, cruising dark highways, looking for their next victim. The experience changed Mike forever. He installed multiple dash cameras, carries pepper spray, and never travels the same route twice in a row. He checks his mirrors obsessively and feels his pulse quicken whenever he sees headlights, maintaining consistent distance behind him. The scariest part isn't what happened to Mike. It's what might have happened to drivers who weren't as careful, weren't as lucky, or weren't as prepared. In the vast emptiness of the American highway system, where help can be hours away and cell service is spotty, predators have endless opportunities to hunt. Every night, thousands of truck drivers navigate dark interstates alone, vulnerable to anyone twisted enough to use the highway system as their personal hunting ground. Mike's story is a reminder that the real monsters aren't supernatural. They're human, they're patient, and they're out there right now, waiting in the darkness between cities, watching for their next opportunity to turn someone's routine drive into a nightmare that will haunt them forever. Tommy Rodriguez had been hauling freight across the Midwest for 12 years when he discovered the frequency that changed everything. It was during a particularly brutal winter run from Chicago to Kansas City in January 2019, when a massive blizzard had shut down most of Interstate 70. Tommy was one of the few drivers crazy enough to keep rolling through the whiteout conditions, his CB radio crackling with warnings from other truckers about jackknifed semis and impassable roads ahead. Around 3 a.m., Somewhere in the middle of nowhere, Missouri, Tommy's CB started acting up. The usual chatter from other drivers faded into static, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press against his eardrums. He fiddled with the dial, trying to find a clear channel, when he stumbled across something that made his blood run cold. At first, it sounded like children singing, a soft, haunting melody that seemed to drift through the static, like voices from another world. But as Tommy listened more carefully, he realized it wasn't singing at all. It was crying. Multiple voices, all children, sobbing in perfect unison. The sound was so realistic, so heartbreaking, that Tommy had to pull over and check if there were actual kids somewhere in his cab. The crying continued for exactly 3 minutes, then stopped abruptly. What followed was worse than silence. It was the sound of breathing. Slow, deliberate breaths that seemed to fog up Tommy's windshield from the inside, even though his heater was running full blast. Each exhale created a visible cloud of condensation that spelled out words. "Help us," appeared on the passenger side window, then faded away. Tommy grabbed his phone to record what was happening, but the device was completely dead. Not low battery, dead, as if something had drained every bit of power from it instantly. His dashboard electronics began flickering, and the temperature inside his cab dropped so fast he could see his own breath, mixing with the mysterious condensation on the windows. The breathing sounds from the radio grew louder, more urgent. Tommy could hear what sounded like scratching, as if fingernails were clawing at the inside of his speakers. Then came the whispers, dozens of young voices, talking at once, creating a horrifying chorus of pleas. "Don't leave us here. It's so cold. We can't find our way home. Please, mister, please help us." Tommy's hands shook as he reached for the radio dial, desperate to change the frequency and make it stop. But no matter which channel he turned to, the voices followed. They were somehow embedded in his radio system, growing stronger and clearer with each passing minute. The children described being lost in the snow, trapped in a place where it was always winter, always dark, always cold. One voice, a little girl who couldn't have been more than 7 years old, began speaking directly to Tommy. She knew his name, knew he was a truck driver, knew he was alone on the highway. She told him about the others, dozens of children who had gotten lost in blizzards over the years, whose bodies were never found, who were still wandering in an endless winter looking for help that never came. The temperature in Tommy's cab continued dropping. Ice began forming on the inside of his windows, creating intricate patterns that looked disturbingly like tiny handprints. His breath came out in visible puffs that seemed to hang in the air longer than they should, forming shapes that resembled small faces before dissipating. Then the little girl's voice changed, becoming urgent and terrified. She warned Tommy that something else was in the static with them, something that hunted the lost children, something that fed on their fear and desperation. She begged him to turn off the radio before it noticed him, before it realized there was a living person listening to their frequency. But Tommy couldn't move. The voices had become hypnotic, drawing him deeper into their frozen world. He could almost see them through his frosted windshield, small figures stumbling through endless snowdrifts, their lips blue with cold, their eyes reflecting a terrible hopelessness. They reached toward his truck with fingers that looked like icicles, pleading for warmth, for rescue, for someone to acknowledge their existence. The scratching sounds from the radio grew violent, as if something with claws was trying to tear its way out of the speakers. The children's voices became screams of terror, warning Tommy that the hunter had found them, that it was coming for him too. The ice on his windows began cracking in spiderweb patterns, and through the fractures, Tommy could swear he saw glowing eyes watching him from the storm outside. His truck's engine suddenly died. All the lights went out. The only sound was the howling wind and the terrified sobbing of invisible children. In the absolute darkness of his cab, Tommy felt the temperature plummet even further. His fingertips went numb, then his toes, then his face. He was freezing to death in his own truck, trapped in some impossible winter that existed between radio frequencies. The little girl's voice cut through the chaos one final time, barely a whisper. "Don't let it take you too. Turn off the radio, save yourself." With the last of his strength, Tommy lunged for the CB radio and ripped the power cord from its socket. The moment the connection broke, everything stopped. The temperature shot back to normal. His engine roared back to life. His phone flickered on, showing dozens of missed calls from his dispatcher, wondering why he hadn't checked in. Tommy drove straight through to Kansas City without stopping, but the experience had changed something fundamental inside him. He couldn't shake the memory of those children's voices, couldn't forget the feeling of otherworldly cold that had nearly claimed his life. Worse, he began researching missing children cases along his usual routes and discovered a horrifying pattern. Over the past 50 years, more than 30 children had vanished during winter storms in the Midwest. Their bodies were never recovered, their cases eventually went cold, and their families were left with nothing but questions and grief. The disappearances always happened during the worst blizzards, when visibility was zero and rescue efforts were impossible. Tommy started carrying copies of missing person flyers in his cab, studying the faces of lost children whose cases dated back decades. Sometimes, late at night on empty highways, his CB radio would crackle with static, and he would hear echoes of familiar voices, the same children who had spoken to him during that terrifying night in Missouri. He never tuned to that frequency again, but he didn't need to. The voices found him anyway, whispering through his radio during the loneliest hours of the night, reminding him that somewhere in the static between stations, trapped in an eternal winter, dozens of lost souls were still crying for help that would never come. Tommy quit long-haul trucking 6 months later, but he still wakes up some nights in a cold sweat, hearing the sound of children crying and feeling ice crystals forming on his bedroom windows. He knows the frequency is still out there, waiting for the next lonely driver to stumble across it during a winter storm. And he knows that someday, those lost children might find a way to drag someone else into their frozen world, where the snow never stops falling and the cold never goes away. Danny Walsh thought he knew every inch of Interstate 80 from Sacramento to Reno. He'd been running that route twice a week for 8 years, hauling produce from California's Central Valley to Nevada's casinos and restaurants. The highway was as familiar to him as his own driveway. Every curve, every hill, every mile marker between the Pacific coast and the desert. That's why what happened on a foggy October night in 2020 shook him to his core. It started around 2 a.m. as Danny was climbing through the Sierra Nevada mountains. A thick fog had rolled in, reducing visibility to maybe 20 feet in front of his headlights. The kind of soup that made experienced drivers slow to a crawl and pray they didn't rear-end someone who'd stopped in the roadway. Danny had his hazard lights flashing and was creeping along at about 25 when he saw the mile marker. Mile 187. The problem was, mile 187 didn't exist on this stretch of I-80. Danny knew the numbering system by heart. Mile 186 was just before the Cisco Grove exit, and mile 188 was near the Soda Springs turnoff. There was no mile 187. There had never been a mile 187. But there it was, glowing white in his headlights, standing exactly where it shouldn't be. Danny slowed even further, squinting through the fog to make sure he wasn't seeing things. The sign looked identical to every other mile marker on the interstate. Same green background, same white lettering, same reflective coating. Except it marked a mile that couldn't possibly exist. As Danny passed the impossible marker, something changed. The fog seemed to thicken around his truck, becoming so dense that his headlights barely penetrated 5 feet ahead. The familiar sounds of the highway, the rumble of his diesel engine, the whir of his tires on asphalt, became muffled and distant, as if he were driving underwater. Then he saw the hitchhiker. A figure stood on the shoulder, thumb extended, completely motionless in the swirling fog. Danny's headlights swept across the person as he passed, but the fog made it impossible to make out any details. Just a vague human shape that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. In 8 years of night driving, Danny had seen plenty of hitchhikers, but none that stood so perfectly still, like a statue waiting by the roadside. A quarter-mile later, he saw another one. Same pose, same unnatural stillness, same light-absorbing quality. Then another, and another. Soon, Danny was passing hitchhikers every few hundred yards, all identical in their motionless stance, all equally invisible, except for their basic human silhouette. The fog began playing tricks with distance and perspective. Danny felt like he'd been driving for hours, but his odometer showed he'd only covered 3 miles since passing the impossible mile 187. The road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, each curve revealing more fog, more hitchhikers, more impossible geography that shouldn't exist. His CB radio crackled with static, then went dead. His GPS showed a blank screen with the message, "Location not found." Even his truck's built-in navigation system seemed confused, displaying question marks where the highway number should be. It was as if he'd driven off the edge of the mapped world into some place that existed between the official mile markers. The hitchhikers began to change. Instead of standing motionless, they started turning their heads to track Danny's truck as he passed. He couldn't see their faces through the fog, but he could feel their attention, like cold fingers pressed against his spine. Some of them took a step toward the roadway as his headlights approached, as if considering whether to walk directly into his path. Danny tried to radio for help, switching between CB channels and emergency frequencies, but every channel produced the same result: dead silence broken only by occasional bursts of static that sounded disturbingly like whispered voices. The words were too distorted to understand, but the tone was unmistakably urgent, as if dozens of people were trying to warn him about something terrible approaching. Mile 187.5 appeared in his headlights. Then, mile 187.7. Then, mile 187.9. Danny realized with growing horror that he was trapped in a single mile of highway that had somehow been stretched into an endless loop. The mile markers were counting up in fractions, as if distance itself had become elastic and strange. The hitchhikers were getting bolder. Some now stood directly on the center line, forcing Danny to swerve around them. Others walked alongside his truck, keeping pace despite his vehicle's speed, their footsteps somehow audible over the engine noise. When Danny looked in his mirrors, he could see them following behind his trailer, a growing procession of shadowy figures that emerged from and disappeared back into the fog. By mile 187.99, there were hundreds of them. They lined both sides of the highway like spectators at a parade, all facing Danny's truck, all perfectly silent. The fog had become so thick that Danny could barely see the road surface, navigating only by the reflective lane markers that seemed to glow with their own internal light. Then he saw mile 100, the real mile 188, exactly where it should be according to every map and GPS system in existence. As Danny's headlights hit the familiar marker, the fog suddenly lifted like a curtain being pulled back. The hitchhikers vanished instantly, leaving no trace they had ever existed. His radio crackled back to life with normal highway chatter. His GPS reactivated, showing his exact position on I-80 between Cisco Grove and Soda Springs. Danny pulled into the next truck stop and spent 20 minutes checking his logbooks, his odometer, and his watch. According to every instrument in his truck, he had driven exactly 1 mile between markers 187 and 188. The trip had taken precisely 2 minutes and 37 seconds, normal time for that stretch of highway at reduced speed. But Danny knew he had experienced something impossible. He had been trapped for what felt like hours in a mile of road that officially didn't exist, surrounded by figures that shouldn't have been there, driving through fog so thick it seemed supernatural. He researched the area when he got home, looking for accidents, disappearances, or historical anomalies that might explain what he'd experienced. What he found chilled him more than the encounter itself. Over the past 30 years, 7 drivers had reported similar experiences on that exact stretch of I-80, always during heavy fog, always involving impossible mile markers and mysterious hitchhikers, always lasting exactly 1 mile before returning to normal highway. 3 of those drivers had disappeared entirely. Their trucks were found abandoned at truck stops or rest areas, engines still running, logbooks showing they had simply stopped mid-route for no apparent reason. The drivers were never seen again, as if they had walked away from their lives and vanished into the fog. Danny still drives I-80, but he takes a different route when the weather forecast calls for fog in the mountains. He's heard other truckers whisper about mile 187 on CB radio late at night, stories of drivers who got lost between the markers, who picked up hitchhikers that weren't quite human, who found themselves driving the same mile over and over until they either escaped or became part of whatever haunted that impossible stretch of highway. Sometimes, on clear nights when the stars are bright and the road is empty, Danny thinks he can still see them in his peripheral vision. Figures standing by the roadside, thumbs extended, waiting patiently for the next driver to get lost in the fog and discover the mile marker that doesn't exist on any official map, but shows up exactly when you need it least. Jake Morrison had pulled into thousands of truck stops during his 15-year career, hauling freight across the country, but he'd never seen one quite like the Sunset Ridge Travel Plaza. It appeared in his headlights around 3 a.m. on a moonless night in rural Nebraska, a sprawling complex of fuel pumps, parking spaces, and a main building that seemed far too large for such a desolate stretch of Interstate 80. What struck Jake first was how perfect everything looked. Most truck stops showed their age: cracked pavement, flickering neon signs, weeds growing through the asphalt. But Sunset Ridge looked like it had been built yesterday. The parking lot was pristine. The building's exterior gleamed under perfectly positioned floodlights. And even the fuel pumps looked brand new, despite the retro 1980s styling. Jake needed fuel and a bathroom break, so he pulled his rig into an empty parking space near the building. That's when he noticed something odd. Despite the truck stop's immaculate condition and bright lighting, there were no other vehicles anywhere. No cars, no trucks, no motorcycles. Just empty space stretching in all directions under those 2 bright lights. The main building's glass doors slid open automatically as Jake approached, triggering a cheerful electronic chime. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh white glow that made his skin look pale and sickly. The layout was typical: rows of snacks and drinks, a hot food counter, gaming machines, and a small seating area with plastic tables and chairs. But something was wrong with the merchandise. Jake walked down the snack aisle, scanning the shelves, and realized that while everything looked normal from a distance, the details were all wrong. The candy bars had familiar brand names, but the lettering was slightly off. Sneakers instead of Snickers. Kit Kat with 2 T's. The soda cans bore logos that almost matched Coca-Cola and Pepsi, but not quite. Behind the counter stood a clerk who smiled too widely when Jake approached. The man looked to be in his 50s, with perfectly combed gray hair and a uniform that seemed pressed and starched despite the late hour. His name tag read Harold in friendly letters, but his eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire visible portion, like looking into 2 dark wells. "Welcome to Sunset Ridge," Harold said in a voice that sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a deep hole. "What can I get for you tonight?" Jake mumbled something about needing to use the restroom and purchasing some coffee. Harold's impossibly wide smile never wavered as he pointed toward a hallway at the back of the store. "Restrooms are down the hall past the arcade. Coffee's fresh. Made it just for you." The hallway was longer than it should have been, stretching back much farther than the building's exterior dimensions would allow. The walls were lined with old photographs in cheap frames, pictures of truck drivers, families, travelers, all smiling at the camera. But as Jake walked past them, he noticed something disturbing about the people in the photos. Their eyes were wrong, just like Harold's, completely black, reflecting the hallway's fluorescent lights like dark mirrors. The restroom was spotlessly clean, almost surgical in its sterility. Jake splashed water on his face and looked in the mirror, trying to shake off the creepy feeling that had settled over him since entering the building. In the reflection, he could see the bathroom door behind him, and for just a moment, he thought he saw Harold standing there, watching him. But when Jake spun around, the doorway was empty. Back in the main store, Harold was waiting with a steaming cup of coffee and that same unsettling smile. The coffee smelled incredible, rich and aromatic in a way that made Jake's mouth water, despite his growing unease. He paid with cash, noticing that Harold's fingers were unusually cold when their hands briefly touched during the transaction. "Drive safe now," Harold said as Jake headed for the exit. "And remember, Sunset Ridge is always here when you need us. Always open, always waiting." Jake climbed back into his truck and pulled out of the parking lot, eager to put some distance between himself and the bizarre truck stop. But as he merged back onto the interstate, he realized he couldn't remember exactly where the exit had been. He checked his GPS, scrolled through the truck stop directory on his phone, even pulled up satellite maps of the area. There was no Sunset Ridge Travel Plaza anywhere along this stretch of I-80. 3 hours later, Jake pulled into a legitimate truck stop in Iowa for his mandatory rest break. He mentioned Sunset Ridge to another driver, describing the strange clerk and the too perfect facility. The other trucker, an older man named Carl, went pale. "You went inside?" Carl asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Jesus, son, you're lucky to be alive." Carl told Jake about the stories that circulated among long-haul drivers, whispered conversations on CB radio during the loneliest hours of the night. Stories about truck stops that appeared when drivers were exhausted, desperate, or lost. Places that looked perfect on the surface, but were actually something else entirely, something that fed on travelers who stopped for food, fuel, or rest. According to Carl, drivers who stayed too long at these phantom truck stops were never seen again. Their trucks would be found abandoned on remote stretches of highway, fuel tanks empty, logbooks showing impossible mileage readings. Security cameras at real truck stops sometimes caught footage of missing drivers walking into facilities that didn't exist, following clerks with black eyes into buildings that were bigger inside than outside. "The coffee," Carl said urgently. "Please tell me you didn't drink the coffee." Jake's blood turned to ice. He had drunk the coffee, nearly the entire cup during his drive to Iowa. It had been the best coffee he'd ever tasted, so rich and satisfying that he'd drained it without thinking. Now, hours later, he realized he felt strange. Not sick exactly, but different. Hollow. Like something inside him had been scooped out and replaced with emptiness. Over the following weeks, Jake tried to return to his normal routine, but the encounter at Sunset Ridge had changed him in ways he couldn't explain. Food had no taste. Sleep brought no rest. He felt constantly hungry, but could never satisfy the craving, no matter how much he ate. Worst of all, he found himself searching for the truck stop during every night run, scanning the horizon for those two bright lights and that perfect parking lot. Other drivers began to avoid Jake. They said he looked wrong somehow. Thinner, despite eating constantly. Paler despite spending his days in the sun. And his eyes had developed a strange quality that made people uncomfortable. Jake caught his reflection in truck stop mirrors and understood their fear. His eyes were changing, growing darker around the edges, as if something was slowly consuming them from within. The craving grew stronger each night. Jake would find himself taking detours down unfamiliar roads, following half-remembered exit signs, searching for a truck stop that existed somewhere between the official highway maps and the dark spaces that hungry things called home. He knew that when he finally found Sunset Ridge again, and he would find it because it was calling to him now, Harold would be waiting with that too wide smile and another cup of perfect coffee. Jake's truck was found 3 months later on a lonely stretch of Nebraska highway, engine still running, fuel tank mysteriously empty, despite being filled just hours before. His logbook showed he had traveled 847 miles that night, but his GPS indicated he had never left the truck stop where he'd started his shift. Security cameras captured footage of Jake walking into a brightly lit building that appeared to be a truck stop, following a man in a pressed uniform toward a coffee counter that glowed like an altar under fluorescent lights. The building vanished from the footage 60 seconds later, leaving only empty highway and the distant glow of Jake's abandoned truck. But drivers still report seeing Sunset Ridge on moonless nights when the highway stretches endlessly ahead and the fuel gauge shows empty and the coffee craving becomes too strong to resist. They see the perfect parking lot, the two bright lights, and Harold standing behind the counter with his black eyes and impossible smile, waiting patiently for the next traveler who needs to stop. Just for a moment, just for some coffee, just long enough to feed the thing that lives in the spaces between real places and makes truck stops appear when hungry drivers need them most. Rick Martinez had hauled everything during his 20-year trucking career: electronics, furniture, livestock, even hazardous materials that required special permits and routing. But he'd never hauled anything quite like the cargo he picked up from a nondescript warehouse in Detroit on a cold March night in 2021. The shipping manifest listed it simply as medical equipment bound for a research facility in Atlanta. What it didn't mention was that the equipment was still occupied. The warehouse was located in an industrial district that looked abandoned even during daylight hours. Broken streetlights cast weird shadows between empty buildings, and the only sound was the distant rumble of traffic from the interstate. Rick backed his trailer up to the loading dock, where two men in surgical masks and latex gloves were waiting with a single large crate. The crate was massive, easily 8 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 3 feet deep. It was made of heavy steel with reinforced corners and multiple warning labels plastered across its surface. Fragile, this side up, refrigerated transport only, and most ominously, do not open under any circumstances. The men secured it in Rick's trailer without saying a word, handed him the paperwork, and disappeared back into the warehouse before he could ask any questions. As Rick pulled away from the loading dock, he noticed his trailer felt heavier than usual, despite carrying only one crate. His truck strained to accelerate, and the weight distribution seemed off, as if the cargo was shifting around back there. But when he checked his mirrors, he could see the crate was properly secured with heavy-duty straps and hadn't moved an inch. The first sign something was wrong came about an hour into the drive. Rick was cruising south on I-75 when he heard a sound from his trailer that made his skin crawl, a soft scratching noise, like fingernails dragging across metal. He pulled over at the next rest area and walked around to check his cargo, but everything looked normal. The crate sat exactly where the warehouse workers had placed it, straps tight, warning labels still firmly attached. Back in his cab, Rick tried to convince himself it was just the normal sounds of a truck settling into highway rhythm. But as the miles rolled by, the scratching grew louder and more persistent. It developed a pattern. 3 quick scratches, pause. 3 more scratches, pause. Like someone tapping out a distress signal from inside the crate. Around midnight, the scratching was joined by something worse. Whispers. At first, Rick thought it was just wind whistling through gaps in his trailer doors. But when he turned off his radio and really listened, he could make out actual words. Muffled voices speaking in what sounded like different languages, all talking at once, creating a disturbing chorus of pleas and warnings that seemed to emanate from the steel crate. Rick pulled into a truck stop outside of Cincinnati and called the number on his shipping manifest. The line was disconnected. He tried the backup contact. Another dead number. Even the address for the research facility in Atlanta turned out to be bogus when he looked it up online. He was hauling an unknown cargo for a company that didn't seem to exist, bound for a destination that wasn't real. The voices from the trailer grew stronger, while Rick sat in the truck stop parking lot, trying to figure out what to do. He could hear them clearly now through the cab's rear wall, dozens of people speaking in frightened, urgent tones. Some spoke English, pleading for help, asking to be let out, describing a darkness that never ended. Others spoke in languages Rick couldn't identify, but the desperation in their voices was universal. One voice cut through the chaos, a young woman speaking with a southern accent that reminded Rick of his own daughter. She begged him to open the crate, said she'd been trapped inside for so long she couldn't remember what sunlight looked like. She described being taken from a hospital, being told she was part of a medical study, waking up in complete darkness, surrounded by others who had been similarly deceived. Rick's hands shook as he considered what to do. Every instinct told him to call the police, but what would he tell them? That his cargo was talking to him? That he was hearing voices from inside a sealed medical container? They'd think he was having a breakdown or hallucinating from too many hours on the road. As the night wore on, the voices became more insistent. They told Rick about the others who had tried to transport them, drivers who had gone insane listening to the constant pleas for help, who had eventually opened the crate only to find something far worse than they'd imagined. The voices warned him about the research facility, described experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics, spoke of procedures that kept them conscious, but unable to move or scream. The temperature inside Rick's cab began dropping despite his heater running full blast. Frost formed on his windows in patterns that looked disturbingly like handprints pressed against glass. The voices grew clearer, more distinct, as if whatever barrier separated them from the outside world was weakening. Rick could hear individual stories now. A construction worker who'd been in an accident, a homeless woman who'd accepted what she thought was free medical care, a college student who'd volunteered for what seemed like a routine study. By dawn, Rick couldn't take it anymore. The voices had been talking to him all night, telling him their names, their stories, begging him to set them free from whatever nightmare they'd been trapped in. He pulled into an abandoned truck stop and walked back to his trailer with a crowbar, determined to see what was really inside the crate. The lock was heavy-duty, but Rick's crowbar made quick work of it. As the steel lid creaked open, the voices suddenly stopped. Complete silence fell over the trailer, broken only by the sound of Rick's own terrified breathing. Inside the crate was a thick layer of dry ice, creating clouds of vapor that obscured his vision. As the fog cleared, Rick saw what looked like medical equipment: tubes, wires, monitoring devices, and life support systems. But the equipment was connected to something that made Rick's mind reel with horror. Human forms, dozens of them, suspended in some kind of preservative solution, their bodies connected to machines that kept them alive, but unaware. Their eyes were open, but vacant, their mouths frozen in silent screams, their limbs positioned as if they'd been trying to claw their way out when the preservation process began. Rick stumbled backward, slamming the crate shut and securing it with trembling hands. But he could still hear them, not the preserved bodies, but something else, something that had been using their voices to communicate with him. Whatever intelligence lived in that crate had been pretending to be the victims, mimicking their pleas for help, to manipulate him into opening their prison. The real voices started then, inhuman sounds that seemed to come from the spaces between the bodies, hungry whispers that promised to show Rick things that would make him understand, that would make him want to join them in their preserved paradise. The crate began rocking back and forth despite its weight, straps straining against something that was trying to break free from inside. Rick drove straight to the nearest police station and turned himself in, babbling about illegal medical experiments and voices in his trailer. When the officers opened the crate, they found exactly what the manifest had promised: legitimate medical equipment being transported to a research facility in Atlanta. Brain scanners, heart monitors, surgical instruments, all properly documented and accounted for. But Rick knew what he had seen, what he had heard. The voices still whisper to him sometimes, late at night when he's trying to sleep in whatever psychiatric facility currently houses him. They tell him about the others who are out there, being transported in similar crates, calling out for help that will never come. They remind him that he could have joined them, could have found peace in their preserved darkness, could have stopped the terrible weight of consciousness that comes with being alive and aware. Other truckers report similar experiences now. Loads that whisper, cargo that pleads for freedom, shipments that seem to have a consciousness of their own. Most drivers learn to turn up their radios and ignore the sounds from their trailers. But some can't resist the voices, can't stop themselves from investigating what they're really hauling through the night. Their trucks are found abandoned on remote highways, trailers empty except for normal cargo, and the lingering smell of preservative chemicals. The voices are still out there, traveling the highways in unmarked crates, calling out to drivers who are alone enough, tired enough, or curious enough to listen. They promise answers to questions you didn't know you had, offer glimpses of a reality that exists beyond the boundaries of normal human experience. All you have to do is open the crate and see what's really inside. All you have to do is listen when the cargo starts whispering back. Bobby Fletcher had been adjusting truck mirrors for 18 years, but he'd never encountered anything like what happened during his run from Portland to Phoenix in November 2019. It started with a simple side mirror replacement at a sketchy truck repair shop outside of Bakersfield, the kind of place that stayed open all night and didn't ask too many questions about where you got your parts or how you paid for them. The old mirror had been vibrating loose for weeks, creating blind spots that made Bobby nervous on busy highways. When he spotted Midnight Auto Repair glowing under flickering neon signs, he pulled in despite the late hour. The mechanic who greeted him was a thin, greasy man with yellowed teeth who introduced himself only as Pete. He quoted a fair price for the mirror replacement and promised to have Bobby back on the road within an hour. Pete worked quickly in the harsh glare of floodlights, removing Bobby's damaged mirror and installing what looked like a standard replacement. But when Bobby climbed back into his cab and adjusted the new mirror, something immediately felt wrong. The reflection was too clear, too sharp, showing details that shouldn't have been visible in the dim lighting of the repair shop parking lot. As Bobby pulled back onto Highway 99, he noticed the mirror seemed to reflect more than it should. While his other mirrors showed the expected view of his trailer and the road behind him, the new mirror revealed things that weren't there or shouldn't have been there. He caught glimpses of movement in shadows where no movement should exist, saw shapes darting between other vehicles that looked almost human, but moved in ways that defied physics. At first, Bobby convinced himself it was just his tired eyes playing tricks. Long-haul truckers were notorious for hallucinating after too many hours on the road, and Bobby had been driving for 14 straight hours. But as the night wore on, the images in the mirror became impossible to ignore. The mirror began showing Bobby things that were happening inside other vehicles. As he passed a sedan on a dark stretch of highway, the mirror revealed the driver slumped over the steering wheel, blood streaming from a head wound, even though the car was maintaining perfect speed and staying in its lane. When Bobby looked directly at the vehicle with his own eyes, the driver appeared perfectly normal, alert, and healthy. A few miles later, the mirror showed him a family in an SUV. But instead of the normal scene of parents and children on a road trip, Bobby saw them screaming in terror, their mouths open wide, their eyes reflecting some unspeakable horror. Yet when he glanced at the SUV directly, he could see through the windows that the family was calmly sleeping, the children peaceful in their car seats. The mirror was showing Bobby the truth beneath the surface, revealing the hidden reality that existed parallel to the normal world. Every vehicle he passed contained secrets, tragedies, or horrors that were invisible to the naked eye, but crystal clear in the cursed reflection. The worst revelation came when Bobby used the mirror to check his own trailer. Instead of seeing his cargo of furniture and appliances, the mirror showed him dozens of pale figures clinging to the outside of his truck. They had elongated limbs and faces that were almost human, but stretched wrong, as if someone had tried to reshape clay into human form without understanding the proper proportions. Their eyes were solid black, and their mouths moved constantly, as if they were trying to communicate something urgently. Bobby pulled over at the next rest area, his hands shaking as he grabbed a flashlight and walked around his trailer. Everything looked normal. No figures, no anomalies, just his standard cargo load, secured with regulation straps and ties. But when he returned to his cab and checked the mirror, the pale figures were still there, still clinging to his truck, still trying to tell him something with their soundless voices. As the night progressed, the figures in the mirror became more agitated. They pointed at other vehicles, gestured frantically at Bobby, and seemed to be warning him about something approaching. Their silent screams became more urgent, their movements more desperate, as if they were trying to prepare him for some terrible event that only they could see coming. The mirror began showing Bobby glimpses of the future. He saw his own truck jackknifed across multiple lanes of highway, saw emergency vehicles with flashing lights, saw body bags being loaded into ambulances. The images were brief, but terrifyingly detailed. Specific mile markers, recognizable landmarks, even the exact position of the sun in the sky suggesting these events would happen at dawn. Bobby tried covering the mirror with a towel, but somehow he could still see through the fabric as if it were transparent. He attempted to adjust the mirror so it pointed away from the road, but it kept returning to its original position no matter how many times he moved it. The cursed reflection had become fixed on showing him things he didn't want to see, truths he wasn't meant to know. The pale figures grew more frantic as Bobby approached the exact location he'd seen in his visions of the future. They pointed ahead, gestured wildly, and pressed their faces against what seemed to be an invisible barrier between their world and his. Through the mirror, Bobby could see that the highway ahead was littered with wreckage, twisted metal, scattered cargo, and emergency responders who moved with the slow, deliberate motions of people dealing with mass casualties. But when Bobby looked through his windshield at the same stretch of road, everything appeared normal. Early morning traffic flowed smoothly, the pavement was clear, and there were no signs of any accident. The mirror was showing him an event that hadn't happened yet, a future tragedy that was somehow approaching with inevitable certainty. Bobby tried to radio other truckers, warning them about potential hazards ahead, but his CB produced only static. He attempted to call 911 to report a possible accident, but his phone showed no signal, despite being in an area with normally excellent coverage. The pale figures in the mirror gestured more frantically, pointing at his steering wheel, seeming to urge him to take some kind of action. As dawn approached, Bobby realized the horrible truth. The mirror wasn't just showing him the future, it was showing him his role in creating it. The accident he'd seen would be caused by his own actions, by decisions he would make in the next few minutes. The pale figures weren't trying to warn him about someone else's tragedy. They were trying to prevent him from becoming the cause of it. Bobby pulled his truck to the shoulder and sat there as other vehicles passed by, their drivers unaware of the catastrophe that hung in the balance. In the mirror, he could see the pale figures nodding approvingly, their frantic gestures calming to gentle encouragement. By choosing not to drive forward, by refusing to play his part in the predetermined tragedy, Bobby had somehow changed the future the mirror had shown him. But the mirror's curse wasn't finished with him. As Bobby sat on the highway shoulder, the reflection began showing him other futures, other potential tragedies he might cause or prevent. He saw himself driving through a school zone at the exact moment children would be crossing the street. He saw his truck's brake failure causing a chain reaction collision that would claim dozens of lives. He saw every possible disaster that could result from his continued presence on the highway. Bobby abandoned his truck that morning, walking away from 18 years of trucking career and never looking back. The vehicle was found 3 days later by Highway Patrol, engine still running, cargo intact, but with no sign of the driver. The replacement mirror was gone, removed so cleanly that it left no trace it had ever been installed. Other truckers report encounters with Pete's Midnight Auto Repair, always in different locations, always offering quick fixes for reasonable prices. Those who accept his mirror replacements find themselves seeing things that exist in the spaces between reality and reflection, witnessing futures that haven't happened yet, but might, discovering that some truths are too terrible to bear, and some knowledge comes with a price that can't be paid. The mirrors are still out there, installed on trucks across the highway system, showing drivers glimpses of worlds that exist parallel to our own. Most truckers learn to ignore what they see in the cursed reflections, to focus on the road ahead and trust only what their own eyes tell them. But some can't resist looking, can't stop themselves from seeking the truth that hides beneath the surface of normal reality. Their trucks are found abandoned on remote highways, mirrors missing, drivers vanished into whatever world exists on the other side of reflection, where pale figures cling to the outside of vehicles, and the future writes itself in images too horrible to ignore. Dave Kowalski thought he knew every way station between Chicago and Denver after 12 years of hauling machinery across the Midwest. Department of Transportation scales were just part of the job. Routine stops where officials checked your weight, your logbooks, and your equipment before waving you back onto the highway. That's why what happened at mile marker 247 on Interstate 80 in Iowa shattered everything Dave thought he understood about the rules of the road. The way station appeared in his headlights around 2 a.m. on a foggy October night in 2020. Dave was running a load of industrial equipment from Chicago to Colorado, staying ahead of schedule despite the poor visibility. The electronic sign read, "All trucks must enter," in the familiar orange letters, so Dave downshifted and guided his rig onto the scale platform. But something was immediately wrong with this way station. The building looked decades older than any DOT facility Dave had ever seen. Weathered brick walls, small windows with bars across them, and a chimney that leaked black smoke into the night sky. The scale itself was massive, far larger than necessary for weighing trucks, with strange symbols carved into the concrete platform around the edges. A figure emerged from the building wearing what looked like a DOT uniform, but the clothing seemed old-fashioned, as if it had been tailored in the 1950s. The inspector was a tall, gaunt man with pale skin and eyes that reflected the way station's floodlights like an animal's. His name tag read, Inspector Morrison, but the letters seemed to shift and blur whenever Dave tried to focus on them. "Evening, driver," Morrison said in a voice that echoed strangely, as if he were speaking from inside a deep well. "Please, step out of your vehicle for inspection. We need to check more than just your cargo tonight." Dave climbed down from his cab, paperwork in hand, but Morrison wasn't interested in his logbooks or bills of lading. Instead, the inspector walked slowly around Dave's truck, running his fingers along the trailer's surface and occasionally pressing his ear against the metal as if listening for something inside. "Your cargo weight looks fine," Morrison said, consulting a clipboard that seemed to be covered in writing Dave couldn't quite read. "But there's something else we need to measure. Step onto the platform, please." Morrison gestured to a small section of the scale platform that had been marked off with white paint. Dave hesitated. In 12 years of trucking, no inspector had ever asked him to stand on the scales personally. But Morrison's pale eyes held an authority that seemed to compel obedience. So Dave stepped onto the designated area. The digital readout flickered and displayed numbers that made no sense, not weights measured in pounds or tons, but strange calculations that seemed to shift and change as Dave watched. Morrison consulted his clipboard and frowned, making notations with a pencil that left marks, even though Dave couldn't see any graphite touching the paper. "Interesting," Morrison murmured. "You're carrying more than your manifest indicates. Much more. We're going to need to do a detailed inspection." Morrison led Dave into the way station building, which was far larger inside than its exterior dimensions should have allowed. The interior looked like a cross between a government office and an old-fashioned medical examination room, with filing cabinets full of manila folders, examination tables covered in white sheets, and strange equipment that hummed and clicked in the shadows. "Sit here, please," Morrison said, indicating a chair positioned in front of what looked like an enormous balance scale, the old-fashioned kind, with 2 plates suspended from a central beam. But instead of weights on one side, the left plate held objects Dave couldn't identify, dark, shifting things that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Morrison began asking questions that had nothing to do with trucking regulations. He wanted to know about Dave's childhood, his relationships, his regrets and disappointments. With each answer, Morrison made more notes on his mysterious clipboard, and the objects on the scale seemed to grow heavier, causing that side of the balance to sink lower. "Tell me about the accident in Milwaukee," Morrison said suddenly. Dave's blood turned to ice. The accident had happened 8 years ago, a moment of inattention, a red light he'd run, a pedestrian who'd stepped into the crosswalk at exactly the wrong moment. Dave had never been charged. The insurance had covered everything, and officially the incident was classified as unavoidable. But Dave knew the truth. He'd been tired, distracted, pushing too hard to make a delivery deadline. "I don't know what you're talking about," Dave lied. Morrison smiled, revealing teeth that seemed far too sharp for human anatomy. "The scale doesn't lie, Mr. Kowalski. You're carrying the weight of that man's death, plus the guilt from the family you destroyed, plus the shame of never confessing what really happened. That's quite a heavy load for one truck to bear." The balance scale tipped further, and Dave could see his reflection in the dark objects on the left plate. But his reflection looked wrong. Older, more haggard, with hollow eyes that held depths of guilt and regret he'd tried to bury for years. The image showed him as he really was, stripped of all the lies he told himself about that night in Milwaukee. Morrison continued his interrogation, asking about other incidents Dave had tried to forget. The time he'd driven while drunk and nearly hit a school bus. The load of medicine he'd abandoned when his truck broke down, knowing sick people would go without their prescriptions. The bribes he'd accepted to falsify his logbooks. The safety inspections he'd lied about. The regulations he'd ignored to save time and money. With each confession, the scale tipped further, and the dark objects on the left plate seemed to grow more solid, more real. Dave realized they weren't objects at all. They were the accumulated weight of every wrong choice he'd ever made, every moment of selfishness and cowardice given physical form. "The problem," Morrison explained, consulting his clipboard, "is that you're overweight, far too heavy to continue on the highways. We're going to need to lighten your load." Morrison opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder with Dave's name on it. Inside were photographs, documents, and what looked like medical records dating back to Dave's childhood. But the pages also contained things that shouldn't exist. Records of thoughts Dave had never spoken aloud, memories he'd tried to suppress, dreams and nightmares that had visited him in the darkest hours of the night. "We offer several options for weight reduction," Morrison said. "We can remove specific memories. The accident, for instance, could be completely erased from your mind. Or we can transfer the guilt to someone else, perhaps a family member who's never done anything wrong. The most popular option is complete personality restructuring. We keep your body and your trucking skills, but replace everything else with a cleaner, more efficient model." Dave realized with growing horror that this wasn't a normal way station. It was some kind of supernatural processing center where the moral weight of souls was measured and adjusted. The other files in Morrison's cabinet contained the names of thousands of drivers who had passed through this facility, all of them carrying loads too heavy for normal highways to bear. "What happens if I refuse?" Dave asked. Morrison's smile grew wider, showing more of those impossibly sharp teeth. "Then you continue carrying your current load, but it will keep getting heavier. Every mile you drive, every day you live, the weight of your choices will increase until it crushes you completely. Most drivers prefer our services to that alternative." Dave looked at the balance scale, watching his reflection in those dark objects that held his accumulated guilt and shame. He thought about the relief of having it all taken away, of driving away from this place with a clean conscience and no memory of the pain he'd caused others. But something inside him rebelled against the offer. Those memories, even the terrible ones, were part of who he was. The guilt and regret had made him a more careful driver, a more considerate person. Taking away his mistakes would also take away the lessons they'd taught him. "I'll keep my load," Dave said finally. Morrison looked genuinely surprised. "Are you certain? The weight will only increase. Every time you make another mistake, tell another lie, hurt another person, the load gets heavier. Eventually, it will destroy you." "Then I'll have to be more careful about what I add to it," Dave replied. Morrison shrugged and made a final notation on his clipboard. "Very well. But remember, Mr. Kowalski, we're always here when you change your mind. The scales never close, and the weight never stops accumulating." Dave walked back to his truck, climbed into the cab, and drove away from the weigh station. When he checked his mirrors, the facility had vanished, leaving only empty highway behind him. But Dave could feel the difference in his truck. It was indeed heavier now, weighted down with the full knowledge of everything he'd done wrong in his life. The load never got lighter. If anything, it grew heavier over the years as Dave became more aware of how his choices affected others. But he also became a better driver, a better person, carrying his burden with the knowledge that some weights are meant to be borne rather than transferred to others. Other truckers report encounters with similar weigh stations, facilities that appear on empty stretches of highway when drivers are carrying more than cargo in their trailers. Some accept Morrison's offer and drive away unburdened, but somehow diminished. Others, like Dave, choose to keep their loads and live with the consequences of their choices. The weigh station is still out there, appearing to drivers whose souls have grown too heavy for normal highways to support. Morrison continues his work, offering relief to those who can't bear the weight of their own actions. But the scale always balances eventually, and someone, somewhere, always pays the price for the loads we choose to carry through the dark hours of the night. Marcus Williams had owned his Peterbilt 379 for 6 years when he bought the used sleeper berth from a truck salvage yard outside Memphis. The original berth had been damaged in a minor accident, and Marcus needed a replacement before his next long-haul run to Seattle. The salvage yard owner, a nervous man with twitching hands, sold him the unit for half the usual price and seemed eager to get it off his lot. The berth looked normal enough, standard size, decent condition, with dark blue curtains and a firm mattress that showed minimal wear. What the salvage yard owner didn't mention was where the berth had come from, or why the previous owner had ripped it out of his truck in the middle of the night and demanded it be destroyed. Marcus had the berth installed at a truck shop in Little Rock and was back on the road within 12 hours. His first night sleeping in the new berth seemed perfectly normal. He pulled into a rest area outside Nashville, drew the curtains, and settled in for his mandatory 8-hour break. The sleep was deep and restful, the kind of solid rest that long-haul truckers rarely experienced. But when Marcus woke up, he noticed something strange. His logbook showed he'd been asleep for exactly 8 hours, but his truck's clock indicated only 3 hours had passed. Even stranger, his GPS showed he'd somehow traveled 47 miles while parked at the rest area. Marcus checked his fuel gauge and odometer. Both confirmed that his truck had been driven while he slept. At first, Marcus assumed there was a malfunction with his truck's electronics. GPS systems glitched sometimes, and clocks could be affected by electrical problems. But the next night, the same thing happened. Marcus went to sleep at a truck stop in Wyoming and woke up to find his truck had somehow moved to a different parking space, facing the opposite direction from where he'd parked. Security cameras at the truck stop showed something that made Marcus's blood run cold. The footage revealed his truck starting up at 3 a.m., and driving itself around the parking lot for nearly an hour. The cab lights were on, and through the windshield, the cameras captured a figure behind the steering wheel. But Marcus had been asleep in his berth the entire time, and the figure driving his truck didn't look quite human. The shape was roughly Marcus's size and build, but its movements were wrong, too fluid, too precise, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. When the figure turned toward the camera, its face was a perfect blank, featureless, except for two dark holes where eyes should have been. Marcus tried staying awake for the next several nights, but exhaustion eventually forced him to sleep. Each time he used the berth, the same thing happened. He would fall into an unnaturally deep sleep and wake to find his truck had been driven by something that wore his appearance, but wasn't him. The entity seemed to be learning, becoming more confident with each night, taking longer trips and venturing farther from wherever Marcus had parked. Other truckers began reporting strange encounters with Marcus's truck during the hours when he should have been sleeping. They described seeing his Peterbilt on highways where Marcus had no memory of driving, operated by a driver who waved but never responded to CB radio calls. Some said the figure behind the wheel looked wrong somehow, as if someone had tried to recreate Marcus's appearance from a poorly developed photograph. The entity's trips became more ambitious. Marcus would go to sleep in one state and wake to find evidence he'd driven hundreds of miles overnight. His fuel consumption increased dramatically. His tires showed unusual wear patterns, and toll road cameras captured images of his truck passing through areas Marcus had never visited. Worse, the entity seemed to be interacting with people during these nocturnal journeys. Marcus received thank you cards from strangers, claiming he'd helped them with roadside assistance in the middle of the night. A waitress at a diner in Oklahoma called to thank him for the enormous tip he'd left after a meal Marcus had no memory of eating. Gas station attendants recognized him from previous visits that had never happened. The entity was living a parallel life, using Marcus's truck and identity, creating relationships and experiences that Marcus would never remember. It was as if something had learned to inhabit his berth while he slept, taking control of his vehicle and his appearance to explore the world during the hours when Marcus's consciousness was absent. Marcus tried sleeping in motels instead of his berth, but the entity seemed bound to the truck rather than to him personally. Hotel security cameras captured his Peterbilt leaving parking lots in the middle of the night, driving itself with the same featureless figure behind the wheel. The entity appeared to be growing stronger, more independent, less dependent on Marcus's physical presence to animate his truck. The breakthrough came when Marcus installed a hidden camera in his cab, positioned to record the berth area while he slept. The footage revealed something that defied explanation. As Marcus fell asleep, a shadowy duplicate of himself began forming on the berth beside him. The duplicate was translucent at first, like smoke shaped into human form, but it gradually solidified until it looked exactly like Marcus in every detail. The duplicate would then climb out of the berth, start the truck, and drive away while Marcus continued sleeping. But the most horrifying part was what happened to Marcus while his duplicate was gone. The cameras showed his body becoming increasingly transparent, fading until he was barely visible against the berth's dark fabric. The entity wasn't just copying him, it was slowly replacing him, drawing substance from his sleeping form to make itself more real. Marcus realized he was being consumed by something that lived in the berth, something that fed on the dreams and life force of whoever slept there. Each night, he became a little less solid, while his duplicate became more substantial. Eventually, the entity would be complete, and Marcus would fade away entirely, leaving only the duplicate to live his life and drive his truck. The research Marcus conducted into the berth's history confirmed his worst fears. The previous owner, a trucker named Ray Sullivan, had mysteriously vanished 3 months before Marcus bought the berth. Ray's truck had been found idling at a rest stop, sleeper berth empty, with no sign of where the driver had gone. Security footage showed Ray entering his berth for the night, but never emerging. But other footage from the same time period showed Ray's truck being driven around the country by someone who looked exactly like him. The duplicate had eventually abandoned the truck and disappeared, presumably to start a new life, using Ray's stolen identity. The salvage yard owner had been desperate to sell the berth because he suspected what had happened, but couldn't prove it. Marcus tried everything to break the connection between himself and the entity. He blessed the berth with holy water, burned sage to cleanse negative energy, even had a priest perform an exorcism. Nothing worked. The entity continued to grow stronger each night, and Marcus could feel himself becoming weaker, more translucent, less connected to his own body. The final confrontation came when Marcus decided to stay awake and confront the entity as it formed. He watched in horror as his duplicate materialized on the berth, becoming solid enough to cast shadows in the dim light. When the duplicate opened its eyes, they were completely black, like looking into deep wells that reflected no light. "You can't stop this," the duplicate said in Marcus's own voice. "I've been waiting in this berth for years, growing stronger with each dreamer who fed me. Soon I'll have enough substance to exist independently, and you'll just be a memory that fades with the morning light." Marcus tried to fight the entity, but his hands passed through it like smoke. The duplicate laughed and explained that Marcus was already more ghost than man, too faded to affect the physical world. The entity had been stealing pieces of Marcus's essence each night, using them to build itself into a perfect replacement. Marcus's truck was found 3 weeks later at a rest stop in Montana, engine running, berth empty except for a faint outline on the mattress that looked vaguely human. The new owner of Marcus's identity has been spotted at truck stops across the country, living Marcus's life better than Marcus ever did, charming other drivers with stories of adventures Marcus never had. The berth was sold again to another unsuspecting trucker, and the cycle continues. Somewhere on the highways of America, the sleeper berth that dreams alone is waiting for its next victim, ready to slowly consume another driver's essence while they sleep, creating perfect duplicates that walk away with stolen lives, while the originals fade into nothing more than impressions on a mattress where dreams go to die and nightmares are born. Leonard Hayes had been driving the same route from Tucson to El Paso for 9 years, hauling auto parts through the desert on Interstate 10. He knew every mile marker, every rest stop, every exit between the two cities. That's why when Exit 66B appeared in his headlights at exactly 3:33 a.m. on a moonless night in August 2021, Leonard knew something was fundamentally wrong with the world. The exit wasn't on any map. Leonard had studied highway atlases, GPS systems, and DOT construction reports for years, and there had never been an Exit 66B on this stretch of I-10. The regular exits were numbered 65, 67, and 69. There was no 66 of any kind, let alone a 66B. But there it was, clearly marked with standard green highway signage, complete with reflective lettering that caught his headlights like a beacon in the darkness. The exit sign read, "Perdition Township, services available," in the familiar white letters on green background that marked every interstate off-ramp across America. But Leonard had never heard of Perdition Township, and according to his maps, this section of desert contained nothing but empty land for 50 miles in every direction. Leonard's fuel gauge showed he had plenty of diesel to reach El Paso, and his logbook indicated he was making good time. There was no logical reason to take an unmarked exit that led to a town that didn't exist, but something about the sign compelled him to slow down, to signal right, to guide his 18-wheeler down the off-ramp into whatever waited beyond the interstate's familiar glow. The exit ramp was longer than it should have been, descending gradually into darkness that seemed thicker than normal night. Leonard's headlights penetrated only a few yards ahead, as if the darkness itself was absorbing the light. The pavement beneath his wheels felt different too, rougher, older, as if this road had been built decades before the modern interstate system. At the bottom of the ramp, Leonard found a stop sign that looked hand-painted rather than manufactured. Beyond it stretched a two-lane road that disappeared into blackness so complete it seemed solid. No streetlights, no building lights, no signs of civilization, except for a weathered wooden sign that read, "Perdition Township, Population 0, in faded white paint. Leonard should have turned around then, should have climbed back onto the interstate and pretended he'd never seen the impossible exit. But truck drivers are curious by nature, and the mystery of this hidden town pulled at him like a fishing line hooked in his brain. He shifted into first gear and rolled forward into the darkness. The road through Perdition Township was paved but cracked, with weeds growing through the asphalt in patterns that looked almost deliberate. Leonard's headlights revealed buildings on both sides of the street. Houses, shops, a gas station, even what looked like a small church with a crooked steeple. But every structure was dark, empty, abandoned for so long that nature had begun to reclaim them. What made Leonard's skin crawl was how perfectly preserved everything looked, despite the obvious abandonment. The buildings showed no signs of vandalism, fire damage, or structural collapse. Windows were intact, doors hung straight on their hinges, and paint looked fresh, despite the deep silence that suggested no one had lived here for years. Leonard parked his truck in front of what appeared to be a general store and climbed down from his cab. The silence was absolute. No wind, no insects, no distant traffic sounds from the interstate. Even his footsteps seemed muffled, as if the air itself was too thick to carry sound properly. The general store's front door was unlocked. Inside, Leonard found shelves stocked with merchandise that looked normal at first glance, but wrong upon closer inspection. Canned goods bore familiar brand names with slight variations. Campbell's soap instead of soup, Coca-Cola instead of Coca-Cola. Newspapers on a rack were dated from various years, but all showed the same headline: Residents report strange dreams. Investigation continues. Behind the counter, Leonard found a guest register book that made his blood run cold. The pages were filled with names, dates, and signatures of people who had apparently visited Perdition Township over the past several decades. But the dates were impossible. Some entries were from the future, others from years before the town could have existed, and many were written in handwriting that seemed to shift and change as Leonard watched. Leonard Hayes had been driving the same route from Tucson to El Paso for 9 years, hauling auto parts through the desert on Interstate 10. He knew every mile marker, every rest stop, every exit between the two cities. That's why when exit 66B appeared in his headlights at exactly 3:33 a.m. on a moonless night in August 2021, Leonard knew something was fundamentally wrong with the world. The exit wasn't on any map. Leonard had studied highway atlases, GPS systems, and DOT construction reports for years, and there had never been an exit 66B on this stretch of I-10. The regular exits were numbered 65, 67, and 69. There was no 66 of any kind, let alone a 66B. But there it was, clearly marked with standard green highway signage, complete with reflective lettering that caught his headlights like a beacon in the darkness. The exit sign read, Perdition Township, services available, in the familiar white letters on green background that marked every interstate off-ramp across America. But Leonard had never heard of Perdition Township, and according to his maps, This section of desert contained nothing but empty land for 50 miles in every direction. Leonard's fuel gauge showed he had plenty of diesel to reach El Paso, and his logbook indicated he was making good time. There was no logical reason to take an unmarked exit that led to a town that didn't exist, but something about the sign compelled him to slow down, to signal right, to guide his 18-wheeler down the off-ramp into whatever waited beyond the interstate's familiar glow. The exit ramp was longer than it should have been, descending gradually into darkness that seemed thicker than normal night. Leonard's headlights penetrated only a few yards ahead, as if the darkness itself was absorbing the light. The pavement beneath his wheels felt different too, rougher, older, as if this road had been built decades before the modern interstate system. At the bottom of the ramp, Leonard found a stop sign that looked hand-painted rather than manufactured. Beyond it stretched a two-lane road that disappeared into blackness so complete it seemed solid. No streetlights, no building lights, no signs of civilization except for a weathered wooden sign that read, "Perdition Township, population 0, in faded white paint. Leonard should have turned around then, should have climbed back onto the interstate and pretended he'd never seen the impossible exit. But truck drivers are curious by nature, and the mystery of this hidden town pulled at him like a fishing line hooked in his brain. He shifted into first gear and rolled forward into the darkness. The road through Perdition Township was paved but cracked, with weeds growing through the asphalt in patterns that looked almost deliberate. Leonard's headlights revealed buildings on both sides of the street. Houses, shops, a gas station, even what looked like a small church with a crooked steeple. But every structure was dark, empty, abandoned for so long that nature had begun to reclaim them. What made Leonard's skin crawl was how perfectly preserved everything looked, despite the obvious abandonment. The buildings showed no signs of vandalism, fire damage, or structural collapse. Windows were intact, doors hung straight on their hinges, and paint looked fresh, despite the deep silence that suggested no one had lived here for years. Leonard parked his truck in front of what appeared to be a general store and climbed down from his cab. The silence was absolute. No wind, no insects, no distant traffic sounds from the interstate. Even his footsteps seemed muffled, as if the air itself was too thick to carry sound properly. The general store's front door was unlocked. Inside, Leonard found shelves stocked with merchandise that looked normal at first glance, but wrong upon closer inspection. Canned goods bore familiar brand names with slight variations. Campbell's soap instead of soup, Coca-Cola instead of Coca-Cola. Newspapers on a rack were dated from various years, but all showed the same headline: Residents report strange dreams. Investigation continues. Behind the counter, Leonard found a guest register book that made his blood run cold. The pages were filled with names, dates, and signatures of people who had apparently visited Perdition Township over the past several decades. But the dates were impossible. Some entries were from the future, others from years before the town could have existed, and many were written in handwriting that seemed to shift and change as Leonard watched. Eddie Castellanos had hauled every type of freight imaginable during his 16 years on the road, but nothing had prepared him for the shipment he picked up from a funeral home in Savannah, Georgia, on a humid September night in 2022. The manifest listed it as mortuary equipment bound for a cemetery in New Orleans, and the funeral director who met Eddie at the loading dock was oddly insistent that the delivery be made before dawn. The cargo consisted of 6 ornate wooden caskets, each one crafted from dark mahogany, with brass fittings that gleamed under the loading dock's fluorescent lights. They were beautiful pieces of workmanship, the kind of expensive coffins that wealthy families ordered for their deceased relatives. What struck Eddie as odd was how heavy they were. Each casket required a forklift to load, despite the funeral director's assurance that they were empty. Premium construction, the funeral director explained when Eddie questioned the weight. Solid wood, lead-lined for preservation. The families in New Orleans appreciate quality craftsmanship. But his hands shook as he signed the paperwork, and he kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to emerge from the funeral home's darkened interior. Eddie secured the caskets in his trailer with extra straps and chains, noting that they seemed to settle into the trailer bed with unusual finality, as if they belonged there. The funeral director handed him a sealed envelope containing specific delivery instructions and emphasized that the caskets must not be opened under any circumstances during transport. The first hour of the drive proceeded normally as Eddie navigated through Savannah's suburban sprawl toward Interstate 16. But as he reached the open highway and settled into cruising speed, he began to notice his truck was laboring more than it should. His engine worked harder to maintain speed, and hills that should have been easy climbs became significant challenges. Eddie pulled into a weigh station outside of Macon to check his load. The scale reading made his blood run cold. His truck weighed nearly 120,000 pounds, far exceeding the legal limit of 80,000 pounds. But according to his manifest, the 6 caskets should have added only about 3,000 pounds to his total weight. Somehow, his cargo had become 40,000 pounds heavier during the first 100 miles of the journey. The weigh station inspector, a grizzled veteran named Chuck, walked around Eddie's trailer with a puzzled expression. "Your axle weights are off the charts," Chuck said, consulting his clipboard. "But I can't see how 6 empty coffins could weigh this much. You sure there's nothing else in that trailer?" Eddie assured Chuck that he was carrying only the caskets listed on his manifest. But even as he spoke, he could feel his truck sinking slightly, as if the cargo was continuing to gain weight while they talked. Chuck made notes on his citation pad, but seemed reluctant to write an actual ticket for something he couldn't explain. Back on the highway, Eddie's truck struggled to reach even 40 miles per hour on level ground. Other vehicles honked angrily as they passed his crawling rig, and Eddie had to use his hazard lights to warn faster traffic of his presence. His fuel consumption had doubled, and the engine temperature gauge crept steadily toward the red zone. Around midnight, as Eddie approached the Georgia-Alabama border, he began hearing sounds from his trailer. At first, it was just creaking and settling noises that could be explained by the excessive weight shifting during turns and stops. But gradually, the sounds became more rhythmic, more deliberate, like someone knocking on wood from the inside. The knocking developed a pattern. 3 slow taps, pause. 3 more taps, pause. It seemed to come from all 6 caskets simultaneously, creating an eerie percussion that echoed through the trailer walls into Eddie's cab. When he tried turning up his radio to drown out the sound, the knocking grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was inside the caskets was demanding his attention. Eddie pulled into a 24-hour truck stop near Montgomery and walked back to inspect his trailer. The caskets looked exactly as they had when loaded, beautiful, expensive, and properly secured. But when Eddie placed his hand on the nearest coffin, he could feel vibrations through the wood, as if something inside was moving around. The brass fittings were warm to the touch, despite the cool night air. A fellow trucker named Sam wandered over while Eddie was examining his cargo. "Heard you coming from a mile away," Sam said. "Sounds like you got some unhappy passengers back there." When Eddie explained about the weight problems and the mysterious sounds, Sam's expression grew serious. "I've heard stories about shipments like this," Sam said quietly. "Coffins that get heavier the farther you haul them. Cargo that makes noise when it should be silent. Word is, some funeral homes don't always wait for people to be completely dead before they box them up." Sometimes folks get buried alive, and their spirits can't rest until they're properly put to ground. Eddie dismissed Sam's supernatural explanation, but he couldn't ignore the evidence of his own senses. His truck was now so heavy, it could barely climb the slightest incline, and the knocking from the trailer had evolved into what sounded like scratching, dozens of fingernails clawing at wood from the inside. As Eddie struggled across Alabama, the temperature inside his cab began dropping, despite his heater running full blast. Ice crystals formed on his windows, and his breath came out in visible puffs. The scratching sounds grew more frantic, accompanied by what sounded like muffled voices, calling for help in languages Eddie couldn't understand. The worst part was the smell that began seeping into his cab. Not the antiseptic odor of embalming fluid, but the sweet, sickening scent of decay mixed with something else. Something that reminded Eddie of wet earth and old graveyards. The smell grew stronger with each mile, until Eddie had to breathe through his mouth to avoid gagging. By the time Eddie reached the Mississippi border, his truck weighed over 200,000 pounds, according to a portable scale at a rest area. The trailer axles were groaning under the impossible load, and Eddie's tires showed signs of dangerous stress. The knocking and scratching from the caskets had become so loud that other truckers at the rest area could hear it from 50 yards away. Eddie called the funeral home in Savannah, but the number was disconnected. He tried the cemetery in New Orleans, but no one answered, despite the late hour. The delivery instructions in the sealed envelope led to an address that didn't exist according to his GPS. Eddie was trapped hauling a load that was literally crushing his truck, while carrying cargo that seemed determined to claw its way out of confinement. The voices from the trailer became clearer as Eddie approached Louisiana. He could make out individual pleas for help, descriptions of being buried alive, and accusations directed at the funeral home that had shipped them. The voices spoke of premature burial, of waking up in darkness and realizing they'd been pronounced dead while still conscious, of clawing at coffin lids until their fingers bled. Eddie realized with growing horror that he wasn't transporting empty caskets. He was carrying the bodies of people who had been buried alive, whose spirits were trapped in their coffins and growing stronger with each mile away from the place where they'd been wrongfully interred. The weight increase wasn't physical, it was spiritual, the accumulated anguish and rage of the improperly buried dead. The climax came as Eddie's truck finally gave up completely on the outskirts of New Orleans. The engine seized, the trailer axles snapped, and the entire rig collapsed under the impossible weight of his cargo. As Eddie crawled from the wreckage, he could hear the caskets splitting open behind him, releasing decades of accumulated suffering into the Louisiana night. 6 figures emerged from the destroyed trailer, not zombies or ghosts, but something far more terrible. They were the spiritual essence of people who had died in agony, who had been buried before their time, whose rage had fermented in wooden boxes until it became something that could affect the physical world. They moved with purpose toward the lights of New Orleans, seeking the funeral home directors and corrupt officials who had profited from their premature burial. Eddie survived the encounter, but he never drove a truck again. He spent weeks in psychiatric care, babbling about cargo that grew heavier with every mile and caskets that contained the concentrated fury of the improperly dead. The insurance investigation concluded that Eddie had suffered a mental breakdown and deliberately sabotaged his own truck, though no one could explain the supernatural weight readings or the testimony of dozens of witnesses who had heard the sounds coming from his trailer. The 6 figures were never seen again, but funeral homes across the Gulf Coast began experiencing mysterious problems: equipment failures, unexplained accidents, and staff members who quit after reporting encounters with angry spirits, demanding justice for the prematurely buried. Some loads are too heavy for any truck to carry, especially when the weight comes not from physical cargo, but from the accumulated suffering of souls who died before their time and refuse to rest until their stories are told.